Empezamos.
Hilter? Karen, can you check, please? Online, can you check online? Because Hilter... Okay. Dear all, thank you very much for joining us and welcome again to our World Heritage 2021 debates and the thematic month dedicated to the impacts of disaster and pandemics on World Heritage sites. I'm Humberto Bonomo, architect here in Chile, director of the Cultural Heritage Center of Catholic University, and convener of One World seminar together with Fernando Perez, Karen Gole, Yolanda Muñoz, and Hilter Gonzalez. And we planned this seminar to celebrate profound knowledge accumulated on how pandemics and social natural disaster have affected and now continue to affect our world heritage. Our speakers will kindly share their case studies, experience, and lessons to allow us creating a vision about the state of health or disease of our world heritage. Throughout these months, we organized more than 20 seminars and conversation, a very collective effort of more than 100 people, some of which from the most remote areas of the globe. Literally today we have all the world well represented from New Zealand to Rapa Nui. Along with thanking all the people who have made this possible, I will also like to thank all the coordinators of each session and the presenter who will accompany us throughout this month. For those who don't know our World Heritage Foundation, it seems relevant to me to recall our aim. The purpose of the foundation is to promote heritage protection, conservation, and management, to support knowledge-based decision-making, to promote good governance of the World Heritage Convention, and to engage and empower civil society in heritage protection and management. Having said this, I now introduce the theme of this month, sharing with you a small video that we prepare. I'm going to share my screen that introduces the session and the thematic disaster and pandemic.
Recent disasters and an actual pandemic have exposed the fragility and vulnerability of our world heritage. These exceptional sites and pieces, which we would like to preserve for all humanity and future generations, do not exist in a segregated world. They belong to our social environment and our daily life. But at the same time, the World Heritage Sites are in danger. They are threatened by natural hazards that attempt against their existence. The pandemic has revealed their fragility and how much the human presence in them is vital and necessary for their survival. How can we protect them and at the same time give them life and new meanings? If we hope for a future for them, we should stop considering them only as beautiful objects or places, merchandise for the tourist industry, and fully integrate them into the social and cultural dynamics of daily life. We propose to promote a great discussion around the world on the risks and effects of disasters and pandemics on World Heritage Sites. We invite non-governmental organizations, academies, representatives of civil society, and local governments to participate, to contribute with new proposals for public policies on the conservation and safeguarding of the cultural and natural heritage of humanity.
And now, today we have a very special session that closed this first week of debates. The session is Natural and Cultural Approaches to Disaster Prevention and Recovery. And the coordinator and host of the session is Maya Ishizawa. Maya Ishizawa works as a consultant with the ICROM World Heritage Leadership Program in the implementation of Panorama Nature Culture, Capacity Building, and World Heritage Leadership Research Network. Her research focuses on the management of cultural landscape and the study of nature-culture interaction in heritage places. Trained as an architect in Lima, Peru, she received a Master of Media and Governance from Keio University in Japan and a PhD in Heritage Studies at BTU Kobus-Senfberg in Germany. As a researcher at the University of Tsukuba in Japan, she coordinated the capacity building program of the UNESCO Chair on the Natural Cultural Linkages in Heritage Conservation. Maya, thank you very much to be the host today, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Bonomo, and thank you very much to the organizing team of Disasters and Pandemics, Yolanda Muñoz and Karen Gole, for their invitation to this activity and their support in the development of this session. Please allow me to dedicate this session to the memory of Professor Humberto Maturana, a Chilean biologist who left us yesterday and who, in my view, is a forerunner in linking nature and culture in his field and an inspiration beyond disciplines. So the title of this session is Nature-Culture Approaches to Disasters Prevention and Post-Disaster Recovery in Heritage Places. In the last few years, cultural heritage and nature-based solutions are increasingly being integrated into disaster risk management strategies and climate change mitigation and adaptation planning. However, the interconnections between natural and cultural heritage are not sufficiently explored and used for disaster risk prevention and post-disaster recovery strategies. In light of the increasing disasters threatening world heritage, in this session we want to explore the opportunities that nature-culture approaches could bring for analyzing heritage places and increase their resilience by planning disasters prevention and recovery in cultural landscapes, urban areas, and natural protected areas. Interconnectedness between natural, social, and cultural systems have become evident through the COVID-19 pandemic we are currently experiencing. We and our ecosystems are independent and our health depends on their health. This is not new knowledge for indigenous communities in many places of the globe, as indigenous local and traditional knowledge still being intergenerationally transmitted shows the deep interconnections between communities and their environments without following the modern nature-culture divide. Our 6 speakers today, who I thank you very much for accepting this invitation, will present a wide illustration of these interconnections, and together we will discuss how we can use nature-culture approaches for a better management of our heritage places amid disasters and pandemics. For instance, climate change adaptation is necessary for increasing resilience, but how can we adapt if we don't clearly understand how climate change is impacting our heritage places? Cultural heritage and natural heritage are not a priority in international cooperation for disasters prevention or post-disaster recovery. How could we highlight its potential? Indigenous knowledge can support resilience, but how can we understand and apply indigenous knowledge in our conservation practices? Our speakers, young and mid-career professionals from a diversity of backgrounds, will reflect on these questions from their own experiences. Firstly, Paloma Guzman will assess the state of conservation system for World Heritage properties, emphasizing on the need of using landscape approaches to report the impacts of climate change in cultural, natural, and mixed World Heritage properties. Secondly, Barbara Garcia Minguez will describe the challenges of including cultural heritage into disaster risk management strategies in the context of international cooperation. She will draw on examples from Europe and Asia to outline the opportunities of using a wider perspective that integrates nature-based solutions and cultural heritage protection for increasing resilience in heritage places. Thirdly, Xavier Ford will talk about the cultural practices of Maori communities which protect their natural and cultural heritage while increasing their resilience to disasters, with the example of the Maori community's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Fourthly, Jefferson Chua will talk about resiliency landscapes in the context of frequent disasters triggered by the eruptions of the Mayon volcano in the tentative list of the Philippines to World Heritage. Fifthly, Alula Tesfaye will talk about the traditional practices of reconstruction used by communities in Gunda Gundo Monastery in Eastern Tigray, Ethiopia, as a strategy for post-disaster recovery in connection with natural hazards. And finally, Pilar Matute will present a history of disasters related to the Rapa Nui National Park World Heritage. After these presentations, we will invite speakers to respond to some questions, and after a short debate, we will invite the audience to ask their question. So now we will start with Paloma Guzman, a Mexican researcher currently working at the Norwegian Institute for Cultural Heritage Research. She holds a PhD from the Eindhoven Technical University in the Netherlands, a master's degree on World Heritage Studies, and a bachelor's degree in architecture. Her research field focuses on the integration of cultural heritage in sustainable development, particularly in urban contexts. She explores landscape-based conservation approaches to bridge interdisciplinary gaps to foster the resilience character of cultural heritage in sustainability agendas, including climate change. Her current research targets the role of cultural heritage as a transformative agent for climate responses. Welcome, Paloma. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Maya. I'm gonna start sharing my screen. Could you confirm that you can see it, please?
Yes. You have to...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you see now the share screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Today, presenting how can landscape-based approaches support the monitoring climate change in World Heritage properties. This is a research that was carried out in 2019, and the aims of, I'm just gonna move there. The aims of this presentation is to provide an overview of how climate change is being addressed by the conservation practice in all categories of World Heritage sites within the monitoring system of UNESCO, and to understand how our conservation practices with landscape-based approaches facilitating the management of environmental changes. I'm going to start just providing a quick definition or explanation of what are landscape-based conservation approaches. I'm going to describe a bit the monitoring system of World Heritage. I'm going to explain the methods for analyzing this topic, and I'm going to explain the results. So first of all, the landscape-based conservation started with a wish to integrate concepts deriving from change, such as development, transformation, and now climate change, and heritage conservation objectives. And it has been the catalyst of the development of a landscape-based concept within heritage research and practice, which actually interconnects conservation within a broader territory and all the dynamics that could be fitting the system in which heritage is embedded. It has developed some management tools and a policy mechanism to integrate policy and practice from multiple and competing land uses through the implementation of adaptive and integrated management systems. Conservation principles with this approach has been implemented within two scientific traditions. For natural sciences has come with biophysical approaches, where it has also been implemented with historic urban landscapes for the arts and humanities for cultural heritage. There are, of course, differences in methodologies and assessment methods and also theoretical basis, but in general, we can say that there are 4 basic principles when it comes to its application in practical matters for managing heritage. These 4 principles are the landscape scale, which means the upscaling of conservation activities within a territory or a broader context, looking for evidence for changes, in this case for climate change, on the impacts of the values of a heritage place, or the lack of availability of monitoring and documentation tools to inform management actions. A landscape governance, which requires the coordination of different plans and tools that are implemented within the territory, and the adaptation measures, which is the ability of systemic measures to address the changes that is affecting a site. So, I'm sorry. The World Heritage Monitoring System, we're basically speaking about the State of Conservation Report. These are key sources on trends and conservation practices and on factors affecting the conservation of the properties. The State of Conservation reports identify climate change and severe weather events among a list of 14 factors affecting the conservation. However, there are some aspects that are not really easy to understand in the way how the values of these sites are often operational through static values and physical delimitations. And heritage values are also differentiated between natural and cultural, which in their monitoring also uses different approaches in terms of disciplinary backgrounds. Climate action also related to World Heritage has been predominantly focused on the risk and vulnerability assessments of the outstanding universal values, and not so much how is actually the implementation and coordination of planning tools is working or not. Another factor that is important to consider when analyzing or using the State of Conservation reports is, of course, that it's also a tool that has been criticized for being highly politicized, because state parties, when discussing the impacts of their properties, they are always trying to avoid the questioning of their World Heritage status. But despite this situation, it's still possible more or less to address and to study how far landscape approaches are guiding the monitoring or advancing the monitoring and understanding of impacts of climate change in World Heritage sites. So we carried out qualitative research on how climate change is being discussed and framed within the reports that are discussed every year. And this analysis was carried out until the year of 2019. So results, we actually found that the first references or discussions on climate change started in 2000, but you can see an exponential increase in the last 3 years, from 2017 to the 19. Also in this graph, you can see the first line is the total World Heritage categories on cultural, natural, and mixed properties, and the actual proportion of the sites monitoring, which it's 14%, for example, is the mixed properties. That means those that are the combination of natural and cultural sites, and followed by cultural, and of course the properties that are discussing it most often is natural sites. The distribution between regionals more or less follows the same distribution of the amount of properties per geographical areas. The only difference, for example, is that African countries tend to overpass the Latin American and the Caribbean country. And for the rest is Europe and Asia, who are mostly discussing impacts of climate change in their properties. When comparing the principles that I was discussing, we found that more than implementation, the World Heritage Committee is expressing concerns, which This mostly mean that our petitions to reduce the impacts of threats, pollution, natural phenomena, and other natural resources depletion that are exacerbated by climate change. This also requires to implement their own monitoring and documentation process in relation to specific climate change and understanding how the World Heritage Properties components and conservation are being affected within a larger territorial scopes and the involvement of a broader range of actors. We can also see that within time, the discussions of climate change have changed in the way of their complexity. So with the time, more implementation and acknowledgement of comprehensive monitoring programs are being requested. And of course, more consideration of the conservation in the form of strategic planning on managing and development applied to a broader territorial level is being requested. And more we can see also recommendations for reporting regular or implementing regular maintenance as a preventive measure for impacts of climate change, adaptive management measures supported by enhanced monitoring tools, and the involvement of wider governance levels acting in collaboration with other sectors for reducing threats and pressures that increase properties' vulnerability to climate change. So we can see then that recommendations are also a big part of the here, are very combined in the sense that the 4 principles are being requested in order to better understand the impacts of climate change. So concerns are still the bigger category, which actually we can understand that current monitoring tools are not being sufficient to understand the impacts. So what do we learn from this? Is that there is a need of clarification regarding what is being monitored and reported as climate change within the discussions of the World Heritage, and the identification of threats resulting from climate change, for example, the increase of a frequency or an intensity of a given natural phenomena, or if climate change is actually having an impact and transforming the environmental settings as part of the Earth's natural processes related to climate change, and where heritage and its values is being embedded are taking their meaning. So as I said, results suggest that current monitoring tools are likely insufficient for assessing the complexity of climate change in relation to World Heritage conservation. So we conclude that there has been progress on on recognizing climate change as a threat to World Heritage properties. And the landscape approach provides opportunities for the upscaling and the understanding of conservation activities in a wider context, including partnerships among different sectoral and governance sectors. But there's still need for deeper connections between the cultural and natural values as evidenced by climate change impacts. Common understanding of what constitutes anthropogenic and climate change and its associated impact, as I was mentioning, is still needed. And of course, this requires to revise the operationalization of the limits of acceptable change without losing heritage values. This is very important when we need to adapt our World Heritage properties to the changes in the environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paloma. Can we stop sharing your screen? Thank you, Paloma. Later on, we will come back to the discussion about your ideas on how to improve the state of conservation system for World Heritage properties, specifically in relation to climate change impacts. And now, let me introduce you Barbara Mínguez Garcia. She's a consultant on disaster risk management and cultural heritage at the World Bank and the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. She has worked in several countries and projects, including Japan, Myanmar, Bhutan, Uzbekistan, Iraq, and Central American region. Before joining the World Bank, Barbara worked at the cultural offices of the Embassy of Spain in Washington, D.C. and the Consulate in New York. She participated in the UNESCO Chair Program on Cultural Heritage and Risk Management at Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, and she's a member of the ICOMOS International Committee on Risk Preparedness. and also a mentor for the ICROM First Aid and Resilience for Cultural Heritage in Times of Crisis 2019 course. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Maya, and thank you for the invitation to present here the perspective from the disaster risk management side. I wanted to start with this photo because usually when we talk about disaster and cultural heritage, we use the example of earthquake affecting buildings. And I wanted to bring the attention on other kind of hazards, like coastal erosion that is influenced by climate change, as you know, and other kind of heritage as archaeological site that many times I'm not taking so much into consideration. And this bring, that we have so many challenges when we connect disaster and heritage. And one of the main probably is understanding the risk that our heritage faced. And you probably are familiar with the way we calculate risk as an interaction of natural hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And in other sectors, you can reduce the exposure in order to reduce risk. But in the case of cultural and natural heritage, and particularly World Heritage sites that you need to take into consideration authenticity and integrity, you cannot change the exposure. So the key to reduce risk is reducing the vulnerability. And in this regard, another big challenge is how sometimes vulnerability is increased due to previous work of conservation that they were not risk informed, such as, for example, happened in Bagan in Myanmar in the earthquake in 2016. The monuments more affected were the ones who have suffered previous reconstruction or conservation works in the past. And another big challenge from the disaster risk management perspective is that sometimes professionals don't know about the heritage, so may decide to demolish some structure at risk without knowing the value I added to those. Another big challenge is the lack of awareness in heritage sites and the development of plans to reduce risks and to create preparedness measures to respond to hazards and to potential disaster. And as a reminder, in the background, you see a photo of the sun that got almost totally destroyed in a fire in 2012. Unfortunately, most of the World Heritage site has not a proper disaster risk management plan and implementation. And at the same time, most of the countries' disaster risk management national plans don't include cultural or natural heritage as a sector to take into consideration. And one of the keys also is the lack of understanding, particularly of what intangible culture is. So the opportunity that came from all this, the main one, I would say that is the collaboration between sectors. Both disaster risk management, cultural heritage, natural heritage, humanitarian people need to work together and collaborate and exchange information and exchange lessons learned in order to protect the sites. And one key thing is to create multidisciplinary teams. And this works in both directions. People working on disaster risk management need to consider heritage and work with professionals who knows about heritage. And at the same time, people working in heritage sites or museums or collections need to integrate disaster risk management into their management sites. Another key point is to use the crisis as opportunities to improve the previous situation. So it's what we call build back better. And is after a crisis happens, the recovery process should not go back to the previous situation, but improve and reduce the risk. And in this regard, it's very useful to use previous experience and lessons learned, and even from other countries. I wanted to bring the example of Japan, that we developed a couple of years ago, a program on resilience cultural heritage. And we use this experience and lessons to be applied to other contexts. For example, bringing an example of a nature-based solution, You see in the screen the image of Kiyumisera temple to reduce landslide risk. And this was transferred, all this information, to a team working in Albania, in Europe, that was looking for solutions to reduce landslide without affecting the landscape and the impact. So this really worked. And another example, also building in Japanese experience and shared with other countries, is the engagement of local communities. Because in the face of a crisis in a heritage site, the first responder are the local community that are there, they know their heritage, they know the site, and then can help in the emergency preparedness and the emergency response. At the same time, they have knowledge that can be used to create awareness of risk and to reduce either risk and increase resilience. As an example, I love the smoke zone that create awareness about the possibility of a tsunami happening after a earthquake. So all this kind of information make very critical the role of international institution and the international community on working together and bringing all this experience and lessons learned to be adapted to local context and to adapt good solution and best practices to each kind of cultural heritage. Because working in other sectors in disaster risk management is very easy, maybe to share experience to create a road, for instance, or other kind of infrastructure. But in heritage, you know that it's very different in each country, so you need to really work together to adapt the best solution to each context. And one critical thing, and it was also mentioned in the video, is the engagement of the tourist sectors. Because tourists create an additional vulnerability to site, because people, visitors usually are not familiar with the hazards and even the proper area where they are visiting. But at the same time, tourists can be at risk itself when governments or countries are focusing the economic development on tourists instead of focusing on the preservation of the heritage and the connection to the local community. So this is one of the key things that also bringing from the international perspective, we should foster. So overall, I would say that the main challenge is the lack of connection between sectors, and this at the same time bring the main opportunity, that is the collaboration, right? And the good news, bringing an example from Europe, is that there are so many initiatives doing this, connecting different sectors and working together to protect cultural heritage and also to use heritage and culture to fight crises of different kinds, either from natural hazards or human-made hazards. And as an example, I'm not going to all of this, happy to share links. Storm, for instance, is working in the first case that I was showing in the Roman archaeological area of Troya, close to Lisbon in Portugal, particularly focusing on the impact of climate change. To conclude the presentation, I wanted to bring a couple of initiatives that focus on capacity building and trainings that I think is a critical thing to strengthen all this network of professionals that I was talking about from different disciplines and for different countries. One is the ICROM First Aid for Cultural Heritage in Time of Crisis, that brings professionals from different countries working together and understanding how the different sectors can work and collaborate together. And likewise, the international training course on disaster risk management for cultural heritage at Resilienc University in Kyoto, that is a similar program, putting together professionals. And by the way, the open call for this year course is open until May 17, I think. So people interested in learning more and participate, I'm happy to share more information and links. So I stop here and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Barbara. So I think there are some comments in the chat, but we will go back to those comments later. First, we will go through all our case studies. So now we will move from international cooperation and the larger picture of World Heritage Sites and the global response to climate change and disasters to a very specific or 4 very specific case studies that we will start with Xavier. Xavier now works for Manatu Taonga, the Ministry for Culture and Heritage of Aotearoa, New Zealand, facilitating projects that support Maori traditional knowledge and innovation after 7 years spent managing the national recognition of sacred and ancestral places of significance to Maori. He is of the tribes of Raukawa, Ngati Toa, and Ngati Huia. Xavier is on the board of ICOMOS New Zealand and co-chairs its Maori Heritage Committee, and he's looking for opportunities to collaborate with First Nation peoples around the world to develop better heritage practices that support their cultural revitalization and self-determination. Welcome, Javier. You can share your screen.
Thank you, Maya. I just confirm with you, Maya, that everyone can see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes, currently. Cool. Brilliant. So, mis saludos cordiales a todos de la Universidad Católica de Chile. You are our hosts, so virtual though it may be, thank you very much for hosting these great discussions. And so what I wanted to talk about today was, as you can see, strengthening communities of knowledge in terms of an Indigenous perspective from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and particularly in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, what the response has been both at a tribal level and in terms of what the government has done as a result of Indigenous advice to the government on how best to respond and plan for future eventualities. So yes, heritage disaster recovery and prevention, as Barbara just said beforehand, this is probably what we think of first and foremost. I know because I got it from the UNESCO Bangkok disaster recovery page, easy Google, to the more strange situation of having a pandemic and what that means for Indigenous heritage, which is gets affected in all sorts of strange ways. So particularly what it's highlighted for us, and it's been very useful in terms of helping us define what the key infrastructure of Indigenous heritage is that it's so dependent on living people. So I've got there our traditional knowledge, all of our practices, crafts, and as well as our rituals to engage in these things and to engage with each other, and our bloodlines and spiritual connections to place, which give us, our bloodlines give us those spiritual connections to place through genealogy and our history on the land. These things are what in particular targeted by a pandemic, because it's a sickness that obviously targets human life, and as well as that, so a disaster that affects human life. And of course it targets the elderly in particular, and they're the holders for us, for Māori tribes in New Zealand. The elders are the holders of our knowledge. They're our experts, and in particular when it comes to our heritage, to all of our practices, whether they be built heritage of some kind and carving and so on, which for us are very important, or the knowledge about our ancestral landscapes, which build up our identity, which I'll give you some examples of. They are in the ones in the line of fire. So how do we protect our heritage? We have to protect our elders. So our response was protect, revitalize, and disseminate. Protect, this was the first thing that happened in Aotearoa as a result of New Zealand as a result of the pandemic. We ended up having roadblocks all over the country, which were tribal roadblocks, which were set up totally illegally, but with the aim of trying to restrict movement, because at least in the government did have policies, obviously, of restricting movement, but these were just their own tribal response. It was very powerful, actually. It's the first time in definitely living memory, but beyond that, in probably 150 years, that the tribes, Māori tribes of New Zealand, have sort of laid down their boundaries in a kind of relatively hard way and said, we're here, this is our territory, and our heritage, our identity is threatened because it threatens our elders. And so the first thing we did was protect. So this is an example of what we did in terms of dissemination, or what we are going to do in terms of dissemination. But it's also quite poignant because one of the people in this photo is one of the only people, two brothers that died of COVID-19 after the initial outbreak. Some months later, two brothers died, and one of them was only 54 years of age, and it's Nigel Tehiko, and he's of one of my tribes of Ngāti Raukua. And that highlighted for us, and he was our tribal historian, and held a lot of important knowledge. And this was a wānanga from, a traditional gathering from a few years ago, to learn the knowledge that he was passing on to us, as well as some other elders, about, in this case, a particular heritage site, which was marked by this, in this case, it's a very old ship mast, and there was a prophet who came here and flew his flag from there. But there's a whole story behind that. And in any case, this is an example of the type of dissemination that we saw of knowledge as a building resilience and building our infrastructure, our heritage infrastructure, about the knowledge of our landscapes going forward, is to actually make sure that the knowledge passes on from those few elders who are vulnerable in a time of pandemic to the wider, well, not to the wider, to their descendants. Because knowledge is, traditional knowledge amongst the Māori tribes is based on descent. So it's not something that you just share with anyone, for all sorts of reasons, including just that belonging to place. So the type of knowledge that we're protecting is, here's an example. What's special about a rock? A rock is a rock is a rock. In this case, it's a rock which has a story associated with it, that a chief, well, basically a beautiful bird started coming to this rock, and then a neighboring chief decided he would try and steal that bird. The bird flew off and disappeared. It was like a spiritual appearance, so to speak. And anyway, to cut a long story short, eventually he came back in his older years and decided to die there at the rock. And the story is that he then fused and became one with the rock. But that's not the only reason why it's important. It's also, so that's your sort of cultural angle on it, so to speak. And the natural angle on it is it's also at the center of these multiple volcanoes that form these plains. And so it's the beating heart of that region. It's what we call a Maori stone. So it carries the spiritual essence of the natural area around it. And so, but without the knowledge held by the elders and their communities of that place, it's just a rock. And it has been treated as such. And of course, many of these places get destroyed around the country, and have been in the past. So the knowledge is what protects that heritage. And so the dissemination of that knowledge is a mechanism of building resilience. So the same goes for our trees, caves, mountains, traditional pathways, food gathering sites, landforms, spiritual pathways. All of these things make up our ancestral landscapes when they're linked together in the spoken word by a knowledgeable descendant, and that's important as well. They can't just, it's not knowledge that can just be gathered and exist on a page somewhere. That's not our understanding of our own Indigenous knowledge, and nor how to keep it alive. So here's some example of some landscape features. The rock at the top left, actually, the Nigel T, who died of COVID-19, he was particularly knowledgeable about that and wrote a story about. So one of our ancestors, earliest ancestors who arrived from the Polynesia here, was pursued by a woman and hid in this rock. And there's all sorts of stories that go with that. And then at the bottom, you've got a landscape feature, which is, you know, formed by accretion, and there'll be many scientific explanation, but for the people down at the top of the South Island where it is, it was created by incantation by one of the first explorers, who was actually pursuing one of his own crewmen who had escaped with his daughter and trying to elope. So these sorts of stories are lost. This knowledge is lost, and it is us if we don't have it, including natural resources. So here's some, you know, an opal, which is a special type of, I suppose you've got a grass, but like pampas actually, or something. So, but it's also the uses of it are many and varied, including, for example, the traditional insulation for our roofs. So all of these materials and practices, the knowledge of which has been whittled down in many cases to nobody, very few people knowing about them anymore and how they are used. Our resilience, how we're going to build resilience for the future, is in part, and this is what tribes have advised the government of New Zealand that they want to see happen, is the revitalization of traditional knowledge through funded grants, so that the tribes can do what they want to do and just apply for the money to do it. And most of that is around gathering together the experts with those who want to learn from their own communities and descendants. Here's the way that a whole ancestral landscape will connect is defined on these sorts of, you know, on a large level with a map. These are ancestors, the people that you've got on one side, whose places and place names and burial sites and body parts are named after landscape, because that's the way we do it when we arrive to claim that landscape for our tribe. These things are all, there's a carved representation of the ancestor who's the summit of this mountain on this particular island of Kapiti, which is in the tribal territory of one of my tribes called Ngāti Toa. And there's the burial caves of many of our ancestral chiefs down one end of the island, named after Tutiremwana's wife. So you can see how our genealogies are imprinted on the landscape, and that's the knowledge that our elders hold for us. And so this knowledge of ancestral landscapes is actually something that we've put particular emphasis on in terms of the government grants and programs to build resilience through the dissemination of knowledge and the gathering of those who are knowledgeable to advance that knowledge and develop that knowledge. So, for example, so you might be familiar. This is a nice volcano, and also our first World Heritage Site, 1993 mixed cultural and natural site called Tongariro, and the first one inscribed for mixed criteria of cultural and natural. And of course, it's just a mountain and a volcano, but in terms of the cultural ancestral landscape, there's a whole line of fire that you can see coming in here, and that's That's the Pacific line of fire and the Ring of Fire, and it's connected to the arrival of some of our ancestors down that line, and the various places associated with them, and one of them in particular who explored all the way to Tongariro. And the story is he actually called on his sisters who were powerful in the ways of under the under earth, the fires under the earth, and they sent him this line of fire to warm him. And so that's an example, and he was one of the first arrivals from Polynesia on one of these waka, an example of the ancestral landscapes that are lost. So thanks to Indigenous advice, the New Zealand government are now funding COVID recovery projects through grants and programs to revitalise traditional knowledge, which we call mātauranga, to build resilience, to prevent the loss of natural and cultural heritage. And particularly because this pandemic situation has threatened our elders, we're able to respond by trying to disseminate that knowledge. Yeah, because in some cases it's been reduced down to one person or no persons in this country. So one example is that Sir Hick Busby, who was one of our elders, or one of the elders up in Ngāpui, and he actually had to go to Micronesia because we didn't have any knowledge anymore of ocean-going canoes, which we arrived on. He had to go to Micronesia to find someone there who would teach us and many other Polynesian peoples from around the Pacific what the remnants of, well, very strong remnants of ocean voyaging, and then revitalize that through dissemination to the point that now there's a center for that type of knowledge that's been set up just this year, so that's a healthy now strand of knowledge where there was nobody left, going back, 1,000 or more years of ancestral knowledge. So yeah, so we want to see more of this effectively. We want to see more of our descendants and groups gathering to learn about their own places, their own heritage, to strengthen their own identity and revitalize their own culture, because that is the infrastructure or the building block of what you could call our Indigenous heritage. And so that's basically been part of our pandemic response. And that's all from me.
Thank you very much, Xavier. That was really, really interesting to learn more about Maori landscape and Indigenous knowledge. We will come back to discuss a bit more about this. And now we will actually keep traveling in the Ring of Fire. We are going to Philippines now with Jeff Chua, who currently works in Greenpeace Philippines as a campaigner. And previously he's worked in the National Commission for UNESCO in the Philippines as a program officer for the culture sector, and has been involved in the nomination process of Mayon Volcano through the provincial government of Albay. He's an alumnus of the UNESCO Chair on Nature-Culture Linkages, and he has a background in philosophy, and currently his research interests lie in environmental hermeneutics and social volcanology. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you everyone for this event. As Maya said, I'm from Greenpeace right now, so this is kind of like a palate break of sorts. So I'm pretty excited to present here. Let me share my screen. Okay, I hope this is visible to everyone. Okay, so yeah, as Maya said a while ago, thank you for that introduction, Maya. I am going to talk about Mayon. It's a volcano here in the Philippines, and I will talk about how the people in the landscape have basically responded to the pandemic in ways that are also mirroring how they have responded to repeated risks that they have experienced throughout historical time. So just a quick overview of the presentation. So I'll go very, very fast with the site profile, which will then necessarily lead to this discussion of a resiliency landscape, a term that a lot of the stakeholders and experts and through collaborative meetings and exercises have coined this term. So this isn't in the current UNESCO lexicon, but this is pretty much a community-based concept, if you will. Okay. And next, I will talk about how the nature culture approach is kind of like both a hermeneutic and a heuristic, and how this approach specifically has been present already in those communities. It just didn't have any term or concept to nail it down. I will discuss a lot of that, and I will also discuss how this particular approach can help understand the response of that particular area to the pandemic. As you know, the Philippines is second, if not the first, if I'm not mistaken, now in Southeast Asia with the number of COVID cases. We are the longest lockdown in the world. We are still until lockdown until now, and the current surge is not yet stopped. So it's pretty dire here in the Philippines right now, and in this particular area in the Philippines, they face a lot of other risks, and of course, I will talk about how they have handled it and conclusions and reflections. So without further ado, this is Mayon. There has been a lot of discussion with the criteria that is being considered for it. As Maya said a while ago, way back in the introductions, that Mayon is part of the tentative list of the Philippines since 2015. And these are, the population, around almost 1 million people around the volcano, and the site itself is around 31,000 hectares. It's famous for not just its perfect cone or symmetrical cone, but also of its eruptive cycles. There have been 50 eruptions since records began in 1616. The most destructive one occurred in 1814, which covered 3 towns in pyroclastic deposits, claiming 1,200 lives. And not only that, but the area itself, as we will see later, has been a direct path for a lot of the typhoons, one of which very strongly affected the area 2006, claiming 1,400 lives. And one of the reasons why this is in the World Heritage tentative list is that there is a wealth of tangible and intangible cultural resources associated with the community response of both aesthetic beauty and destructive eruptive cycles, and how they have built up a system of resiliency and disaster management in response to those repeated risks. So in terms of management, these are protected under the National Integrated Protected Area System, which basically takes care of our natural sites here, inscribed natural sites here in the Philippines. And on top of that, the entire province of Albay, where the volcano is located, is also designated as a MAB area under the Man and Biosphere program. And also, one of the key things about this area is that they have an internationally recognized DRM plan. It has been replicated around the world and also here in the Philippines for its effectiveness and ease of implementation during disaster times. And I wanted to show you this to show you the evolution of the nomination. So before, it was really just criteria 7 and 10, which eventually evolved to see how the cultural aspects of the area really contributed to the values in the site, and eventually one of the events that we had in those numerous meetings with stakeholders and experts is really to come together to try to understand what it is exactly in Mayon that can be nominated for the World Heritage. And they have conceived of this concept of a resiliency landscape. So a resiliency landscape is a landscape that reflects historical nature-cultural interactions through aesthetic appreciation and placemaking, myth and world building, land use, and disaster mitigation. and how these have been strengthened through repeated exposure to different kinds of, that should be hazards. And specifically for Mayon, these are the values, the heritage values that they have come up with in the consultative process. So it's an ensemble of natural, aesthetic, and symbolic significance. It's an outstanding example of human volcano interactionism through land use, through religion, and through the sheer diversity of tangible and intangible cultural heritage. And lastly, historical interactions between the community and the volcano as a basis for the evolution of volcano and disaster mitigation science worldwide. In fact, Mayon has been featured in the past 2 IUCN reports on volcanoes as one of the more underrepresented sites that have a lot of potential in the World Heritage List. So we can see it as a synthesis of 1, natural landscape aesthetic values, 2, community resilience values, and 3, lifelong knowledge production values. And this is actually the result of that workshop there. So they tried to see how these specific values can have specific management actions to address them as well. So you see here how this form really an integrated approach, okay, to site management in a disaster context. In a multi-hazard context. And of course, as is want for to everyone very intimately connected to the World Heritage process, the comparable sites that we have seen and have also been recommended by experts are the sites here listed: Civita di Bagnoregio in Italy, Coronian Spit, and Sundondo Valley in Peru, which have demonstrated a lot of these other qualities of what we could call resiliency landscapes. So I wanted to discuss specifically what I mean with nature culture as both a hermeneutic and a heuristic. So this can get a bit theoretical in this sense. So and these reflections also came about after a lot of these consultations with these stakeholders in the community. So nature culture for them, after we've introduced actually the concept after the workshop in Tsukuba, they were able to take it on, and they were able to see that, yeah, it actually exists in the site, that it is a way of deepening the understanding of resiliency and integrated nature of risk, vis-a-vis a lot of human interactions with their specific environment. So in this sense, resiliency is not just a specific linear human response to risk, but rather really a byproduct of the synthesis of this dialectical interaction between cultural and natural values across historical time. And of course, risk is also understood differently. Rather than just a latent phenomenon, they are understood as points of convergence between natural and cultural values. And not just that, nature culture is also seen as a heuristic. It's a framework in protecting sites that have specific nature culture interactions. They saw that adopting this approach in disaster management exposes some elements of risk mitigation that are not apparently obvious, which in turn help protect and strengthen community resiliency. And of course, other types of risks that have not been included in the disaster regime are easier to integrate into the system. One of which is, of course, COVID. By adopting this approach, it becomes easier, at least for the community. And we will see later in the case study, in the very short case study, that it becomes easier to see the emergence of new infectious diseases as one of those points of convergence, okay, that can lead to increased risks in an area. And adopting this approach capacitates these communities in understanding a more holistic, okay, and cross-sectional conception of risk. And this provides these communities with rudimentary resources to respond to these hazards. So I wanted to talk about the pandemic, but not just the pandemic, but also how the area is multi-hazard in context. So last year we were hit by 22 weather disturbances, and the most major of which, specifically Super Typhoon Goni, hit actually Bicol during November of last year. And the area is specifically vulnerable because of repeated lahars. and the fact that Mayon has erupted in the past 3 years, which means that the pyroclastic deposits are somewhat fresh. Okay, so the eye wall with winds of up to 315 kilometers per hour, which is on track as one of the most intense storms on Earth ever. Okay, tracked just a few kilometers northwest of Mayon, and in a strange twist of fate, early warning systems were compromised because the government here politicized a national news and media network, which cut really access for early warning for these far-flung communities. And of course, it resulted in catastrophe. The village of San Francisco in Ginobatan disappeared basically under a deluge of lahar, and 47 people lost their lives there. And of course, this wasn't just the risk that was being confronted by the people there. It was also the second order disaster waiting to happen, okay, with the evacuation. Um, there were fears of it being a super spreader event because, of course, you'd have a lot of people crumpled up in a particular area. But strangely, as you will see in this graph, um, the particular graph from November to January, okay, shows actually a decrease, okay, in actual COVID cases in that particular locality. And yeah, eventually evacuation centers were still managed well with social distancing protocols in place. So this wasn't the only typhoon that confronted the area. There was an earlier typhoon called Vongfong, which passed through the same area. It was the first time during that year that communities around Mayon contended with their recurring typhoon risk in the context of the pandemic. So a lot of the local governments there really changed their approach from 4 to 6 families per room inside the evacuation center to just 2 to 3 families to maintain that 1 meter distance. And they had to adapt to use their typhoon information and warning systems and communication materials to the pandemic. Okay, and it became easier for them to integrate these health protocols to the DRR scheme in place. And one of the DRR officers in Libon, which is a town in near Mayon, says we just have to combine practice that we do for different hazards for as long as lives are not threatened, sacrificed, or at risk. So these were basically the challenges in integrating COVID-related risks to the DRR framework in the area. So first, some local governments reallocated their budget for procurement of equipment for hospitals and PPEs. There was a marked increase of psychosocial issues because of lockdowns and social isolation, and a lot of the usual training of first responders, which really form the important first step in disaster response, were reduced because of social distancing protocols. And lastly, it was really more difficult for localities that do not have established DRR norms in place because they were basically confronting the risk kind of like for the first time, right? And one of the and I guess in reflecting on these matters, there was also a need to see how there needed to be a more organic integration of new media in first response and information dissemination, um, specifically in a post-truth societal context where fake news abounds. It was identified that trust building should be should be capacitated through cultural events. Here we see the linkages between nature and culture again. Um, Integrating more psychosocial support. Fourthly, communications and public science training for first responders, and co-creating these organic communication strategies with local knowledge bearers. Okay? And lastly, to utilize these attributes, okay, and integrating them in early warning systems for more effective dissemination and communication. So this is the last slide. Just some few conclusions and reflections here. So we see here how resiliency landscapes reflect these linkages in terms of risk management and reduction and are important categories, okay, to consider in pursuing a more balanced World Heritage List, especially in an increasingly volatile world where risks abound as human communities encroach more and more into natural environments, because that is the current understanding of COVID, that people have done this encroachment too much, which has resulted in the emergence of these diseases, and that these diseases should not be treated as separate risks. Okay? Through this nature culture approach, we clearly see how interactions between both nature and culture and the place of human agency in them could actually lead to those risks. But conversely, okay, it is also through this approach that disaster response regimes can build resiliency better, even with risks that were not considered before. And this has been shown in Mayon, where because of their repeated exposure to hazards, they were able to adapt faster, okay, to the pandemic. Yeah, and that ends my presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was really amazing presentation. Thank you. Now, because we are exceeding our time already, let's go fastly to Africa with Alula Tesfaye Asfa, who is a lecturer at Mekelle University, Ethiopia, and special researcher at the University of Tsukuba in Japan. He had made his studies of bachelor and master's in Mekelle in architecture and urban planning, and he finished his PhD in World Cultural Heritage Studies in Tsukuba. His dissertation, titled Integrated Approach for Heritage Conservation in Mekelle, Ethiopia through the Historic Urban Landscape Approach. He has worked in restoration of Gundagundo Monastery as project leader between 2015 and 2017. He is currently active in teaching and research in heritage and urbanism, focusing on Ethiopia. Welcome, Alula. Is Alula here? We lost Alula. Well, it seems that Alula is not connected right now. So maybe we just move to Rapa Nui. Yes? Okay, so let's see if Alula can come after. I will contact him. And but then let me introduce you to Maria Pilar Matute Willemsen. She's a graduated from the University of Chile with a major in architecture. She did a master in architectural monument restoration in Barcelona, Spain, where she resided for 5 years, combining her studies with work experience in the private sector related to heritage intervention. Back in Chile, she has worked for 12 years in different public institutions. From 2008 to 2012, she worked as regional heritage manager of the Regional Architecture Directory from the Public Works Ministry in Maule region, a territory in central Chile, which was strongly affected by the 2010 earthquake. Afterwards, she incorporated into the National Council of Monuments, institution in charge of regulation of national heritage, forming part of its regional office in Rapa Nui, Easter Island. And later, she worked from Santiago as member of the team at National Center of World Heritage Sites, National Service of Cultural Heritage, which that under the aegis of the Ministry of Cultures, Arts and Heritage of the Government of Chile, contributes to the technical management of the 6 World Heritage Sites of Chile and its tentative list. Welcome, Pilar. So Pilar will make her presentation in Spanish.
Thank you.
And I will translate slide by slide to English.
Thank you, Maya. ¿Se ve la presentación, cierto?
Sí.
Buen día a todos y a todas. Como Servicio Nacional del Patrimonio Cultural, agradecemos y recibimos con mucho interés la invitación de participar en este panel a cargo del Centro del Patrimonio Cultural de la Universidad Católica y en el marco de la iniciativa Our World Heritage. Con motivo de esta actividad, quiero compartir una historia en la que soy una mera observadora y cuyo protagonista es justamente el patrimonio cultural y su potencial de vinculación y resignificación frente a eventos devastadores de la naturaleza como son los tsunamis. También participan Japón y Chile, unidos geográficamente por el Océano Pacífico y el llamado Anillo de Fuego, así como Minami Sanriku y Rapa Nui, dos localidades singulares de estos países.
Pilar, te traduzco, ¿sí? So Pilar says good morning to everyone, and as the National Center for World Heritage Sites of the National Cultural Heritage Service, she has welcomed the invitation to participate in this panel of the One World Seminar on Disasters and Pandemics by the University of Chile Cultural Heritage Center within the framework of the initiative of our World Heritage, specifically under the theme Nature Culture Approaches to Disaster Prevention and Post-Disaster Recovery in Heritage Places. So on the occasion of this activity, she wants to share a story in which she is a mere observer and whose protagonists are precisely the cultural heritage and its potential for connection and resignification in the face of devastating natural events such as tsunamis. Also participating are Japan and Chile, geographically united by the Pacific Ocean and the so-called Ring of Fire, as well as Minami Sanriku and Rapa Nui, two unique locations in these countries.
Rapa Nui o Isla de Pascua se encuentra ubicada en medio del Océano Pacífico a 3.700 kilómetros de la costa de Chile. Esta isla de aproximadamente 163 kilómetros cuadrados de superficie es mundialmente conocida por su patrimonio cultural, gracias al que forma parte de la lista de Patrimonio Mundial de UNESCO, desde 1995 a través del Parque Nacional Rapa Nui, que constituye un 43% de su territorio, y que hoy es administrado por la comunidad Rapa Nui.
So Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, is located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at 3,700 kilometers from the coast of Chile. This island of approximately 163 kilometers of surface is known worldwide for its cultural heritage, thanks to which it has been part of the UNESCO World Heritage List since 1995 through the Rapa Nui National Park, which constitutes 43% of its territory and which today is administered by the Rapa Nui community itself.
Dentro de este patrimonio cultural es particularmente característico el carácter monumental representado por los moai, esculturas megalíticas de piedra volcánica, generalmente tobalapilli, proveniente del volcán Rano-Raraku, que fueron talladas entre los siglos XI y XVII, llegando a medir hasta 21 metros y alcanzando un peso estimado de 200 toneladas, el más grande del que se tiene registro, y que quedó en proceso de fabricación adherido a la cantera en la ladera del volcán.
Within this cultural heritage, the monumental character represented by the moai is particularly characteristic. These are megalithic sculptures of volcanic stone, generally lapilli tuff from the Rano-Raraku volcano, which were carved between the 11th and 17th centuries, measuring up to 21 meters and reaching an estimated weight of 200 tons, the largest on record and which was still in the manufacturing process attached to a quarry on the site of the volcano.
Si bien el valor histórico, artístico y tecnológico asociado a estas figuras que fueron elaboradas, desplazadas y montadas en sus ajus por los propios Rapa Nui no tiene precedentes, es su valor inmaterial el que los mantiene especialmente vigentes para la comunidad local, valor que los hace herederos y representantes de sus ancestros, de su mana o fuerza ancestral, y que los conecta con la naturaleza, ya sea como orientadores astronómicos, como generadores de fertilidad y riqueza de recursos, o como protectores y guardianes del bienestar de la isla.
Although the historical, artistic, and technological value associated with these figures that were displaced and mounted in their apu by the Rapa Nuis is unprecedented, it is their immaterial value that keeps them especially valid for the local community, a value that makes heirs and representatives of their ancestors, of their mana or ancestral force, and that connects them with nature either as astronomical guides, as generators of fertility and wealth of resources, or as protectors and guardians of the well-being on the island.
Se sabe que cuando un moai salía de la cantera y era izado sobre su plataforma, se le dotaba de ojos de coral y obsidiana o escoria roja, transformándose en la representación de un ancestro y de todo su mana o poder, por lo que el reconocimiento de las cavidades oculares talladas también es un atributo significativo.
It is known that when the Moai left the quarry and was hoisted on its platform, it was endowed with eyes of color and obsidian or red scum, transforming it into the representation of an ancestor and all its mana or power. So recognition of carved eye sockets is also a significant attribute.
En esta misma lógica, la caída de los Moai aparentemente como resultado de una crisis ambiental y social en la isla refuerza su vínculo y relevancia como mediador entre sus habitantes y la naturaleza que los provee y rodea. La ausencia o pérdida de mana se vincula ineludiblemente a los golpes que ha vivido la isla.
In this same logic, the fall of the Moai, apparently as a result of an environmental and social crisis on the island, reinforces its link and relevance as a mediator between its inhabitants and the nature that provides and surrounds them. The absence or loss of mana is inescapably linked to the blows that the island has experienced.
Por otro lado, Rapa Nui también es conocida como el territorio habitado más remoto del planeta. Inserta en el Océano Pacífico, se relaciona a través de esta inmensa masa de agua con las demás islas de su entorno, con la navegación, la cultura polinésica, pero también con los fenómenos naturales que se les vinculan.
On the other hand, Rapa Nui is also known as the most remote inhabited territory on the planet. Inserted in the Pacific Ocean, is related through this immense body of water with the other islands in its environment, with navigation, the Polynesian culture, but also with the natural phenomena that are linked to it.
Uno de estos fenómenos, el tsunami, es capaz de conectar territorios a más de 17.000 kilómetros de distancia. Fruto de la experiencia, cuando hay un terremoto cercano a la costa chilena, pensamos en Japón y viceversa, así como también en Rapa Nui y en las islas que están en esta ruta. Además de océano, compartimos la región más sísmica del planeta, en que se genera cerca del 90% de los terremotos del mundo, por lo que esta relación es bastante frecuente.
One of these phenomena, the tsunami, is capable of connecting territories more than 17,000 kilometers away. As a result of experience, when there is an earthquake near the Chilean coast, we think of Japan and vice versa, as well as Rapa Nui and the islands that are on this route. In addition to the ocean, we share the most seismic region on the planet, where about 90% of the world's earthquakes are generated, so this relationship is quite frequent.
El terremoto de Valdivia del 22 de mayo de 1960 es el evento sísmico de mayor magnitud del que se tenga registro en el mundo, y si bien afectó en tierra al sur de Chile, se propagó a través de las horas y del Océano Pacífico a diversos puntos del planeta.
The Valdivia earthquake of May 22, 1960 is the largest seismic event on record in the world, and although it affected southern Chile on land, it spread throughout the hours and across the Pacific Ocean to various points of the planet.
Unas 6 horas después del evento en Chile continental, una inmensa ola azotó la costa este de Rapa Nui entrando por el sector de Ahu Tongariki, afortunadamente lejos de su centro poblado, pero dejando graves daños en lo que fue uno de los Ahu más excepcionales de su cultura, con 220 metros de largo y 15 figuras megalíticas de cerca de 50 toneladas de peso cada una, que la fuerza del mar consiguió desplazar decenas de metros.
About 6 hours after the event in continental Chile, an immense wave hit the east coast of Rapa Nui, entering through the Ahu Tongariki sector, fortunately far from its populated center, but leaving serious damage in what was one of the Ahu most exceptional of its culture, with 220 meters long and 15 megalithic figures of about 50 tons of weight each, that the force of the sea managed to displace tens of meters.
El tsunami continuó avanzando, consiguiendo llegar otros 7.000 y hasta cerca de 14.000 kilómetros más mar adentro, impactando sobre la costa de Hawái y luego Japón, causando muertes y destrucción a su paso. Uno de los lugares más afectados fue la localidad costera japonesa de Shizugawa, actual Minami Sanriku, ubicada al noreste del país y en que motivó la construcción de diques rompeolas de más de 5 metros luego de que 41 personas perdieran la vida.
The tsunami continued to advance, reaching another 7,000 and up to about 14,000 kilometers offshore, hitting the coast of Hawaii and Japan, causing deaths and destruction in its wake. One of the most affected places was the Japanese coastal town of Shizugawa, now Minami Sanriku, located in the northeast of the country, and which led to the construction of breakwater dikes of more than 5 meters after 41 people lost their lives.
Estos hechos que conmocionaron a través de la historia a sus sobrevivientes y mediante los medios de comunicación continuaron dejando huella y estableciendo relaciones entre quienes comparten las costas del Pacífico. Años más tarde, Japón sería un gestor principal de la restauración del patrimonio Rapa Nui durante la década de los 90, a través del proyecto UNESCO Japón y la donación de la grúa Tadano para este fin, que permitió, entre otras cosas, la restauración del Ahu Tongariki.
These events that shock through history, its survivors, and through the media, continue to leave a mark and establish relationships among those who share the Pacific coast. Years later, Japan would be a main manager in the restoration of Rapa Nui heritage during the 90s through the UNESCO Japan project and the donation of the Tadano crane for this purpose, which allow, among other tasks, the restoration of the Ahu Tongariki.
Por su parte, en 1990, con motivo de la conmemoración de los 30 años del evento, Chile obsequió a Minami Sanriku la escultura de un cóndor y una placa como mensaje de amistad y mutuo entendimiento, los que fueron instalados en un concurrido espacio público de la ciudad y que un año más tarde serían acompañados por la escultura de un moai tallado en Santiago, pasando el sector a llamarse Plaza Chile. La figura del moai se hizo tan popular que años después motivó un trabajo académico de moaización, en que estudiantes junto al comercio local promocionaban el lugar como el pueblo de los moai, mientras que la figura era un hito turístico y formaba ya parte de su imaginario.
For its part, in 1990, to commemorate the 30 years of the event, Chile presented Minami Sanriku with a sculpture of a condor and a plaque as a message of friendship and mutual understanding, which were installed in a crowded space public of the city, and that a year later they would be accompanied by the sculpture of a moai carved in Santiago, the sector being called Plaza Chile. The figure of the moai became so popular that years later it motivated an academic work of moaization, in which students, together with the local commerce, promoted the place as the town of the moai, while the figure was a tourist landmark and was already part of their imaginary.
En febrero del 2010, un nuevo gran terremoto y tsunami impacta Chile y se deja sentir a través del Pacífico. Un año más tarde llega el turno de Japón, con un sismo de aún mayor intensidad, el cuarto a nivel mundial, y que una de las localidades más afectadas es nuevamente Minami Sanriku, que prácticamente desaparece por la fuerza del agua. En medio del dolor y destrucción es encontrada la cabeza del moai mientras el cuerpo se mantuvo en su pedestal. La cabeza fue dejada transitoriamente en el patio de un colegio, momento en que el símbolo local adquiere un nuevo significado, especialmente para los estudiantes para los que la figura se había transformado en un motivo de fortaleza y esperanza.
In February 2010, a new great earthquake and tsunami hit Chile and was felt across the Pacific. A year later, it was Japan's turn with an earthquake of even greater intensity, the fourth in the world, in which one of the most affected towns is Minami Sanriku again, which practically disappeared due to the force of the water. In the midst of the pain and destruction, the head of the moai is found while the body was kept on its pedestal. The head was temporarily left in a schoolyard, at which point the local symbol takes on a new meaning, especially for students for whom the figure had become a source of strength and hope.
Las imágenes conmovieron a un territorio perfectamente capaz de empatizar con la situación y Chile decidió regalar una nueva réplica de moai que fuera esculpida en Rapa Nui. Fue así que desde la isla los escultores Manu Tuki, de 92 años, y su hijo Benedicto decidieron emprender esta tarea juntos con el apoyo de su familia y entregar un obsequio que consiguiera levantar el espíritu a ese pueblo tan lejano pero cercano a la vez.
The moai, found in Japan, today comes from Rapa Nui. It was made by descendants of ancient Rapa Nui sculptures and was blessed in a special ceremony in which the spirits of their ancestors were asked for, this was the latest, The images moved the territory perfectly capable of empathizing with the situation, and Chile decided to give a new moai replica that was sculpted in Rapa Nui. It was thus that from the island, the 90-year-old sculptor Manu Tuki and his son Benedicto decided to undertake this task together with the support of their family and deliver a gift that would lift the spirits of that distance, but at the same time close down.
El moai que hoy se encuentra en Japón proviene de Rapa Nui, fue confeccionado por descendientes de los antiguos escultores Rapa Nui y fue bendecido en una ceremonia especial en que se pidió a los espíritus de sus ancestros por su protección y por la de la ciudad donde ahora se dirigía. El regalo de Rapa Nui a Japón entonces, más allá de lo tangible, es un portador de su mana como energía protectora.
The moai found in Japan today comes from Rapa Nui. It was made by descendants of ancient Rapa Nui sculptures and was blessed in a special ceremony in which the spirits of their ancestors were asked for their protection and that of the city, where he was headed now. Rapa Nui's gift to Japan, then beyond the tangible, is a bearer of his mana as a protective energy.
Trasladar un moai de casi 3 metros de alto desde Rapa Nui a Japón probablemente no es una tarea fácil, así como tampoco lo es transmitir y trasladar su significado a una comunidad distinta. El viaje del moai a Minami Sanriku duró varios meses. Al llegar a Japón formó parte de una exposición en Tokio y Osaka, sobre el vínculo y relación de amistad entre ambos países, para luego, ya en su destino, ir dando paso a nuevos significados vinculados a su preexistencia en la ciudad, a la memoria del desastre, a un futuro de resiliencia y recuperación, así como también vinculados a la solidaridad y empatía entre lugares que comparten una histórica e infortunada confraternidad.
Moving a moai almost 3 meters high from Rapa Nui to Japan is probably not an easy task, nor is it an easy task to transmit and transfer its meaning to a different community. The journey from the moai to Minami Sanriku lasted several months. Upon arrival in Japan, he was part of an exhibition in Tokyo and Osaka on the bond and friendship between the two countries, and then at his destination, giving way to new meanings linked to his pre-existence in the city, to the memory of the disaster, to a future of resilience and recovery, as well as linked to solidarity and empathy between places that share a historical and unfortunate brotherhood.
Los desastres naturales se transforman en dolor y destrucción que en ocasiones logramos canalizar, sobrellevar e incluso prevenir a través de elementos o procesos que se vuelven un patrimonio común, un patrimonio del desastre quizás, representativo de una identidad y de valores que van más allá de lo local y que se va poblando de relaciones cada vez más importantes de comprender, registrar y conservar frente a la adversidad.
Disasters can be painful and destructive, and this pain and destruction that sometimes manages to channel, cope with, and even prevent through elements or processes that become a common heritage, perhaps a disaster heritage, representative of an identity and values that go beyond the local, and that is being populated with increasingly important relationships to understand, record, and preserve in the face of adversity.
Muchas gracias y gracias Maya por la traducción.
Gracias, Pilar. Thank you very much, Pilar. Now I would like to see if Meraji is still with us. Is she still with us, Meraji?
Sí, sí está.
Yes.
Hello, Maya. I'm
Meraji's,
here.
Hello, Meraji is accompanying us from Rapa Nui. She's an archaeologist of Rapa Nui origin with work experience in archaeological research of Rapa Nui, and she has been working for the Technical Secretariat of Rapa Nui Heritage for 9 years, dependent on the Council of National Monuments, National Service of Cultural Heritage, and she has a vast experience in heritage management work and plays an active role in collaborative technical work with the Mauhenua indigenous community, which are the current administrators of the Rapa Nui National Park. And today, Meraji will tell us a bit more, expand a bit the presentation on the current situation in Rapa Nui in relation to the response to COVID pandemic and other strategies that are being used in the island to connect nature and culture to protect the Moai and all the heritage from disasters. Meraji, ¿vas a hablar en español?
I'll try to speak in English. I'm so sorry about the English. My English is not really perfect, but I really want to speak in English. For me, it's very important to be with us today because we are really, really far from mainland and from another place in the world. And it's very important to explain how is our situation now. I don't have a presentation. I just only want to explain about the pandemic situation on the island. And our history have a big relation with the resilient world. Because when the ancient people discover Rapa Nui territory, they only have one important word in this land, and that is the rock. Our culture, we live with the rock. They start to build not only the Moai, they build all of the cultural system with the rocks, like the ceremonial platforms, like the houses with rock, the different tools to work and to build the big moais with rocks, because we don't use iron or another type of materials. We use only the rock. And until today, we use the same basic concept on our island. And the resilience is the most important things, because we don't have a flight comes from mainland, and we only have 2 or 3 ships comes on the months, and we are come back to the different traditional practice. Okay, we don't have tourism now on the island, and we are happy too, because we don't have COVID cases on our island 1 year ago, and that is very good, because our medical system is not really good, but our community start to apply 3 important concepts. One is the tapu. The tapu is means something like the taboo. Is, for example, when the Maya, ¿cómo dices, alcalde?
Mayor.
Hello? When the mayor say, okay, you have to be in a quarantena. Please don't go to the street, and you have to do it that. Okay, that's mean tapu, or like in taboo. The other word is, it's a moa. It means respect to all of these things, like when the mayor say, hey, you don't have to do this or another things, we respect that things. Is the other concept is the humana. That's mean the when you do something for another people, and then you don't wait to that people gives something to you. For example, when you need help to buy your house, all of the community and your family come to help you. And then when someone of the community needs some helps, we go, but we don't wait for money on something like that. Or if you have something like a food to eat, you can give to the people, and then the people give to you too. And we use that 3 different concepts now on Rapa Nui about the pandemic situation. Okay, that is the most important things to care our community. And in relation of the heritage, the national park is totally closed, and we don't have tourism now. And we are very focused to work in a very close relation with the community, with the spiritual things, because now we are looking us to inside our community. We are not working only for the tourists or to prepare the archaeological site for the external person. We are work now for our community, for our kids, for the schools, for the people who need to connect again the archaeological site with the spiritual things of fields. Like we lose some parts of the spiritual things of the archaeological site, because the visit of the tourists have a lot of impact. Okay, and now we try to do some work only about the of a conservation to protect our sites, because here the global impact of the climate change is very important, because all of the archaeological sites, the big platform with the moais, are in the coast of the island. And yes.
Meraji.
Maya.
Sí, te estamos escuchando un poco entrecortado.
Maya, te escucho.
Sí, Meraji. Que necesitamos pasar a la siguiente presentación y te escuchamos un poco entrecortado. ¿Me escuchas? Yeah, I think. Karen, are you there?
Sí, estamos.
Yes. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
Sorry, it's because I'm not sure if it's me who is losing the connection.
No, you're right.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Meraji. We are losing a bit the connection, but we really appreciate that you have been with us and have shared the situation in Rapa Nui and all these concepts that are used from traditional knowledge. I think if we have the chance, we can also relate this to the concepts that Xavier presented before. I think it's a common culture of the Polynesian islands. But now I would like to invite again Alula, who is back with us, right? And make his presentation.
Yes, I'm so sorry for earlier.
Thank you, Alula. Please.
Don't worry.
I will keep it short. I wasted some of your time, so also last presenter. So this is Gundagundo in northern parts of Ethiopia. It's like a monastic community, and it has a peculiar building tradition. And this area is like contested by many of natural hazards like rapid desertification, heat, and also seasonal flooding, landslides, and also not very frequent but minor earthquakes. So this community in that area, they originally it was a monastic community, but over some years it also developed to be secular society as well. So they used stone, mortar, and wood as main construction materials, and the building tradition is it's like a farming. It's like a continuous daily activity, like because there are many natural hazards, especially the landslide. People always are maintaining and rebuilding a part of the wall, or they change deteriorating stones, they replace them. So this is a very continuous activity, and people tend to do this on daily. So these materials are similar for the water channels as well as their residential buildings, also in the civic buildings like the church. So stone and mud is intensively used for virtually almost anything. So if, for example, you can see like the bells here are also made from rock, which they make a very wonderful sound. And so this from 1960s, there was an introduction of new materials in that area, especially to heritage buildings. Corrugated iron sheet was introduced to cover the roofs, and also cement was also introduced to this area. Specifically, these two introduced materials has intensively affected that a tradition that was core to the society's resilience, because this daily activity of construction and repair and checking and replacing the bad materials from the existing wall was disrupted because of these construction materials, which have a relative permanence. So people started to ignore those buildings which are already built by cement. They will think that they cannot be maintained. You cannot like take out one stone from cement wall and then can replace it, or especially with our research. Where I was in Makale University, and at that time this building from 15th century, it's like the main church of the monastery. It's Saint Mary Church, and it was in a very bad condition. This church has a yearly festival, which is usually in January after the harvest. The harvest is around December in Ethiopia, so there will be a feast of Saint Mary in January. So usually the community will gather and clean the church, repair it, and especially they replace the thatched roof every year. And this was a continuous tradition that was happening. But around 40 years ago, there was the emperor commissioned to build a corrugated iron roof for the church, which was considered a very good kind of gift at that time. And some tradition was broken, and the building continued to significantly deteriorate because the community stopped that continuous tradition to repair and replace. So when the reconstruction of this building was initiated, restoration of this church was initiated. It was focused on the community and on the traditions. There are local craftsmen. Almost the farmers are high skilled in stone laying and this kind of activities. So what we did was to give a little scientific dimension of restoration to the local builders, but we also learned so much from local buildings about the materials, which stones are good, and the first project was done mainly on the fence. So the fence was restored, and the tradition was tried to be initiated as they would do in previously in their tradition. So from this this was the condition before the restoration. So recently, I have left for my PhD study to Japan, but the university continued with the community, and then they were able to restore the church back to almost the oldest existing structure. So these traditions are like very important. That is what's the case I want to show, like how these traditions are very, has a wisdom within them to fit with the environment and their immediate challenges. And this picture I took is this kid is reading from the collection of Paul's letters. This book is almost over 500 years old, and I recommended to ask them, like, you should put this in a storage in a museum, and then change this to the modern book, which I would think in a modern way. But the priest thought that this book has a collection of blessing from all the people, all the generations who studied through this book. So this kid will not only is trying to memorize Paul's letters, but he also has responsibility and burden to keep tradition from generations of people who studied from this exact book for over 500 years. And these are important traditions that I have observed and I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much. I will finish with this.
Thank you very much, Alula. Because we don't have so much time left, I think we don't have time to open for questions maybe, but I would like to ask our panelists if they would like to add something or comment on the other presentations, or if they want to just complete some of their thoughts that didn't finish before. Is anyone interested in making a comment after listening to all? Especially I wanted to ask Xavier how he sees this connection with also, I guess, the case of Jeff and the case of Pilar on Rapa Nui and Meraji, and the issue of indigenous knowledge and how to bring it up to be considered in policy making at national levels and maybe also international levels for World Heritage, for example.
Well, that's an interesting question. But it was good to see that there were a few people connected by the Pacific line of fire, even though Pilar reminded us that most of the time that means we'll get a tsunami from Chile, or but it's still a connection. But yeah, in terms of, so one of the interesting things, I suppose, well, and also challenges of dealing with anything to do with indigenous knowledge is that it is about how would I say it? It's about it's about also indigenous control, I suppose. So that's why, for example, when you presented me, Maya, there was a line in there about cultural revitalization and self-determination, like indigenous self-determination. And so I think the challenge there is for our governments in the various countries to accept, to give indigenous peoples agency, and so over their culture, and that's not necessarily a straightforward process or an easy process, but that's what, in my humble opinion, will yield the best heritage outcomes if the custodians of the heritage have the say about how it is treated, or at least have a say, then including in government policy, then the outcomes are likely to be much better. And so, well, for example, the case of Rapa Nui and the changes that have happened there over the last, I don't know, 50 to 70 years are pretty extreme. And so you'd hope now that things would have changed and that would improve the uptake of not just traditional knowledge in terms of how it gets reflected in the various policies about how things happen on the island, because once upon a time, same as here in New Zealand, it was the European ethnologists that came, they wrote down the knowledge, they took the knowledge, they made their publications about these interesting indigenous curiosities and their heritage, and then drew their own conclusions about how they should be treated and the management methods by which these sites should be controlled, and then generally left. And so there's a big change obviously afoot in the world, but we're not quite there. So but yeah, I think that's probably my one big comment in answer to your question, is that Indigenous agency is key to, and heritage custodian, in terms of non-Indigenous heritage as well. If the custodian communities of the heritage are heavily involved and have a degree of autonomy and power in terms of the policy making for their heritage sites, then the outcomes will be a lot better. And sometimes in surprising ways, sometimes in ways which will probably violate what people will think is heritage best practice. Just to give one example, one of the things that Māori have traditionally done with our carefully carved ancestral houses, which may be 70 years old, is when it's time, they decide it's time for a new one, they might just bury these intricate carvings of the ancestors in a swamp, or they might burn the whole house. And so that's always a challenge for heritage practitioners, including those of us who are both, have a foot in both camp. We might be heritage professionals as well as of Indigenous descent. What does that mean? And how does that challenge heritage practice, so to speak, and what the management of these places? Anyway, that's my comment.
Thank you very much, Xavier. Jeff, you want to say something?
Yes, I would echo Xavier's point a while ago, but I also think there are a lot of barriers that impede the movement really from Indigenous agency to policy making, especially in very post-colonial countries such as the Philippines, where Indigenous cultures are fetishized. They're usually interpreted in terms of market access and marketability. They're not really interpreted in terms of adding new knowledge to management regimes, for example, in heritage sites, for example. So I guess in post-colonial societies, I guess all of us here are post-colonial in some way. There is that, shall we say, political aspect that a lot of Indigenous communities have to contend with. I am not part of any Indigenous community, so I can't speak fully. But here, for example, in the Philippines, usually taking on Indigenous rights and taking on Indigenous concerns is usually interpreted as communist concerns. So there is that political element here in the Philippines, which makes it a lot more difficult for indigenous communities to really contribute to policymaking, specifically because they will be targeted to be killed. So it's I guess that difference and that layer is very difficult to get over, especially for indigenous communities, and even for us who are also sharers of that concern, right? With these communities, it's also difficult for us to assume that responsibility because we will be also tagged as communists, for example. Yeah. Yes. So yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, it's true. We have to think about all these layers of complexity related to these issues. Unfortunately, our time is up. But I think there will be another panel on specifically indigenous knowledge in the next sessions. There will be one, I think. So we hope that it can build on this discussion. And so thank you very much to all the panelists, all who accepted and stayed up or woke up very early today to be with us. Thank you very much. And thank you to the audience, the people who accompanied us, and the people from the Center of Heritage, Cultural Heritage in the University of Chile, La Católica. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maya. I would like to, add some few words and to go back to your introduction, Maya, related with Humberto Maturana. I think that the idea of Maturana are really important to make the link between cultural and natural heritage, as you said, and to understand that the extinction, it's really fictitious, especially in the case that we have seen today. And in this same way, I think that as a human, as a species, we have the possibility to transform and to connect ourselves as today we have done. We have all the world really connected. We are sharing knowledge, we are sharing experience, and this maybe it's the most important result and output of this One World seminar. Thank you very much to everybody to join us and to stay connected today. And I would like to invite all of you to follow us during these months. Next Monday, we will have the session named Preparing for Emergency to Ensure Resilience of Cultural and Natural Heritage System Under Threat, a Matter of Good Territorial Governance. The moderator will be Claudio Cimino. And yeah, thank you very much. And try to, if you want to follow us, you can follow us, our social network and stay connected with us. Thank you very much.